Hello and welcome. We are talking about persuasive speaking in this screencast. It should be shorter than my previous one on persuasive messages. And what I'll do in this one is talk a little bit about the way that you can formulate your thesis, which is also known as a proposition. When you transform from informative to persuasive, you go from thesis to proposition. So if you see that word, it just means thesis statement. I'll talk a little bit about some of the alternative speech structures you can utilize. And then the part 3, which will be the third screencast, is going to explain in detail one particular component or speech style for persuasive presenting. So to get us in here from the beginning, we need to first acknowledge audience attitudes. And the audience's attitude is essentially where they stand on the issue you're going to discuss. And the reason that this is crucial to at least give some thought to before you present is an audience's attitude will influence your argument potential. And your argument potential is exactly what it sounds like. It's the potential that your argument or speech has to succeed in influencing your audience members. So, depending on where your audience stands on your topic will depend heavily on your success, but more importantly, it should influence how you write your actual presentation outline. So, first things first, you could have an audience that is just outright opposed to whatever it is you're talking about. This could be two diametrically opposed political viewpoints. This could be, for example, food preference. Some of my friends are absolutely dedicated vegans, where the rest of my friends might be dedicated meat eaters. And so they have very opposed points of view when it comes to eating, which is clearly a very crucial human need. So when they get together, they're going to have a lot of discussions about the ethics, the morality, the health benefits, the negatives, the cost. And so they might be very opposed to each other whenever they get together. When you're talking to an audience that is opposed to you, a good thing to consider would be having neutral statistics. What I mean by that is instead of getting in someone's face and saying, "You're crazy and you're wrong," by the way, you sit here and say, "Let me just show you the research. You can make up your own mind, but let me just show you what the numbers say." So that's very effective for an oppositional audience because it lets them make up their own mind. You are seeking to persuade or influence them. You are presenting the evidence clearly in an organized manner, and that benefits your audience by giving them a chance to absorb the information and come to their own conclusions without you being combative. Because I'm sure most of us know this from personal experience. The moment that we feel attacked, especially if it's something near and dear to us, we kind of raise our hackles, our defenses come up, and instead of listening to the other point of view, we just start thinking of how to defend ourselves. And that is largely why a lot of interpersonal relationships go bad, is because both or all parties are so dedicated to defending themselves, they don't actually clearly listen to the other side. So if you have an oppositional audience, just represent evidence in a very cool, calm, collected, and clear manner that does not attack them directly. They can make their own assumptions from there, but just letting them make their own choices is a beautiful way of dealing with an oppositional audience. You might also have an audience that has no opinion. That is something that is more popular now than I believe ever before. And when I say no opinion, it means they might not be willing to share it or they might not actually have one. So if someone is neutral, that means that they truly do not have a stance for or against the topic. They could be open-minded, they might just not know about it, but whatever it is, they don't have a gut feeling for or against the topic. These are very pleasant audiences to have because they're willing to listen to you and any other point of view and kind of make their own assumptions and conclusions from there. With a neutral audience, you want to make sure that you are very engaging. So this is again boosting those nonverbals, making sure that while you're not overselling it, you believe what you're trying to say. Because a neutral audience will judge more about you as a person and make their judgment from there than they will look at your data. So an opposed audience will probably look at your data and look for the weaknesses. A neutral audience is going to decide whether or not they like you and go from there. An apathetic audience is an audience that just doesn't care. We talked about pathos in a previous one, which means emotion. So apathetic means no emotion. This means they just don't care. So, your challenge with an apathetic audience is to get them to care about the topic. And your tactics for that would be to include relevant examples that would motivate them personally to interact with you. So, you need to give an apathetic audience a reason to pay attention to you. This is how this topic applies to you. This is where you can utilize this information in your personal life. If you give them a reason to listen, then you will probably sway them to your side much more easily. If they don't have a reason to use what you're talking about, then they're just not going to pay attention because they have other stuff going on. The next type of audience you could have would clearly be one that's in favor of what you're talking about. And as you might guess, they're very easy to influence because they're already on your side. If someone already agrees with you, you're just going to make them in more agreement. So the tactics are just be charming and engaging, but please still have good research. So the next thing I want to talk about would be how to identify your proposition. And let's just sit on that for just a minute. As I mentioned in the introduction to this screencast, in Persuasion, we changed the name of your thesis. Instead of it being your thesis statement, it is now called the proposition because the root word for that is proposal. So this is what you are proposing we should agree with us. In an informative presentation, your thesis is essentially, hey, here's my topic, folks. In persuasion, you are proposing something that you want us to believe or be influenced toward or against. So, since you are making a proposal, your thesis is now called a proposition. When it comes to propositions, there are three different ways to write them. Should you take argumentation and debate, this will help you because these are the three propositional types you will encounter in argumentation, so you'll have a leg up there. So the first type of proposition you could have would be a proposition of fact. And a fact proposition is when your presentation is debating or arguing the factual status of something. For example, here is this proposition or thesis sample. Marijuana is addictive. Okay? So I am making my persuasive speech about proving to you, I am proposing to you that marijuana is addictive. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say right now that I know all of my marijuana researchers that are watching this have probably already spluttered at the screen going, no, it's not. Well, that's why it's an argument, okay? So a fact argument is whenever you can take something and argue about whether or not it is a fact. So can I argue that it is a fact that marijuana is addictive? Yes, I can. There's tons of research out there on it. But could you argue that marijuana is not addictive? Yes, there's tons of research on it. That is why it is an argument of fact, because you're arguing with me about whether or not that is a factual statement. So that could be something like ghosts are real or pineapple on pizza is good. Those are factual statements that we can argue yay or nay about. So if your thesis is about something that is factually based, it is a proposition of fact. Now, a proposition of value is a comparison. This is when we are normally weighing or comparing two items against each other, and we're arguing about which one of those two is more important. So, an example here could be that privacy is more important than security. Several years back, there was a terrorist attack on an elementary school that killed about 24 kids and a few teachers. And at the site of that school, they found an iPhone that was theorized to belong to one of the attackers. So the FBI took the iPhone to Apple and said, break into this phone, we need the information on it. Apple said no. Apple is a company that is based on privacy. If you look at their ads, that is their main push, is that your information is safe with them. So Apple said, proposition of value here. Privacy is more important than security. Their point was that our company's entire basis is on privacy. So we will not allow you into this phone because even if it could help you in this situation, it would completely betray our millions of customers. Privacy is ultimately more important than security. Now, clearly, the FBI had the reverse proposition of value. The FBI was going, that's nice, but national security is more important than privacy. If you got stuff on your phone that you don't want people to see, that's your problem. But security is more important than privacy. And so those were the two issues that were debated, and the courts settled in favor of Apple. So Apple did not have to divulge the information of that phone, and honestly, I do not know the current status of the information on that phone, even though this occurred several years ago. You could look it up if you wanted to. So that is a proposition of value when it is comparing two items and kind of telling us which one is more valuable. So, if in your persuasive presentation you are kind of comparing one thing to another thing, it is a thesis of value. Now, the last type of proposition that you can encounter would be a proposition of policy. And these are my personal favorites just because this is the type of person I am. And policy arguments or speeches are all about the word should, and it's about something should change or something shouldn't change or something should be this way or it shouldn't be that way. And that's the way that I think. So I'm naturally just gravitate towards propositions of policy. So the key phrase here is just should. So a should proposition could be something like college textbooks should be free. Can I argue that they should be free? Yes. Can I argue that they shouldn't be free? Yes. Could I argue that they should be less expensive? Sure. Could I argue that they should be rolled into your tuition? Sure. So as long as I have a should in there, it's a policy argument. So policy arguments are about rules, regulations, and policies. So this could be something like parking should be free, or students should get priority parking, or tuition should be lowered. It could be all kinds of things. If the word should shows up in your thesis, it is a policy argument. So to sum up, fact arguments are going to argue about the factual status of something. Value arguments are going to compare and weigh the importance of two concepts. Policy propositions are going to challenge a rule, regulation, or policy and tell us how things should or should not be. So there are multiple different speech patterns that you might encounter. I'm going to briefly go over several, and then my third and final screencast will focus on the one that you will utilize if you are in one of my classes. So if you are going over this on just a YouTube video, then you will probably not have to watch the third one unless your instructor requires that per specific format. But for my students, there will be a third screencast on persuasion that will go over that one format. So, whenever you have a speech that is designed to convince somebody, the first pattern that you can use would be a reasons pattern. And that simply means that the body of your presentation is organized into separate reasons for why you are right. So, you might have the proposition that marijuana is addictive, and then the body of your presentation is reason one, reason two, reason three. The next type of persuasive speech pattern that you could use would be a comparative advantages argument. And a comparative advantages argument is when your speech compares the advantages of what we have now with the advantages of what we could have if we would change something. So this could, for example, be something like switching from gas vehicles to electric vehicles. Here are the current advantages that gas vehicles have, but we could, have these benefits if we would switch to all electric or hydrogen or some alternative fuel. So a comparative advantages case is exactly in the title. It compares advantages, and that's what your main points of your speech do. The next type you could have would be criteria satisfaction. And this is when you're kind of evaluating something. Let's say that you are wanting to buy a new car and you have certain criteria that car needs to meet. Let's say that you want to have remote start, because it's cold in the wintertime and you don't want to have to walk outside in your bathrobe to turn your car on, let it heat up. You want to have heated seats because, again, cold. It needs to have at least 35 miles to the gallon because it'll probably be, a fueled vehicle. So your argument would be about how a certain vehicle meets those three criteria. Whenever I purchased my most recent vehicle a couple of years ago, I had multiple criteria. And whenever I would use different car apps to search for this car, I had my criteria of mileage, gas, fuel efficiency, the luxury elements I wanted it to have. And so I made a argument for how that vehicle satisfied my criteria. So if you do this type of speech, which they are relatively rare, we don't see them too often, then your presentation would be about how a certain way of life or an idea meets certain criteria for approval. You could also have a refutative speech, and a refutative speech is one that's about refutation. And refutation is responding to someone's argument. So if you are in argumentation and debate, there will be a whole series on refutation where it teaches you how to refute or take apart an opponent's case. So a refutative speech would be something where your whole speech is breaking down somebody else's point of view. So it could be like a response speech. Let's say that you watched a TED Talk on a certain point of view, and so you develop a presentation attacking and combating that person's representations. Again, these are rare. You typically see them in debate more than you would a regular speech class, but they are still there. So if there's something that has you all hot underneath the collar and you want to attack it with all your heart and soul, by all means. Now, the next type of speeches that you'll have will be speeches to actuate. And a speech to actuate is a speech that inspires action. So that's what actuate means. So when you actuate somebody, that means you have motivated them to take some type of action. And this, for my classes, is primarily what we do. So the first one that we could have would be a problem solution presentation. This would mean that your first main point would be to explain what the problem is, whether that's climate change or tuition costs or distance of parking space. And then your second main point would be how you plan to resolve that problem. So here's the problem, here's how to fix it, and that's essentially your presentation. And your hope is that you're going to motivate people to go out there and make that solution actually occur. You could also have a problem cause speech, which is where first main point explains the problem and then the second main point explains the cause of the problem. And your hope with that type of speech is that you are going to encourage your audience to go out there and fix the cause. So go out there and resolve whatever it is that's causing the issue. These can be really personal or really separate depending on the type of speech. But for example, a speech that would be a problem solution or problem cause would be something on the lines of getting enough sleep. So the problem could be that you're exhausted all the time and never get anything done. Solution, sleep more. Woohoo! And we hope that we encourage you to sleep more. You could also have a problem cause, which would be problem. You're not sleeping enough. Da 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 da. Here's the cause of your problem. You're on your cell phone or computer for 2 hours before bed, and that has inspired a wake cycle. So different topics can use different formats. However, the one that you will use if you are in one of my classes will be the Monroe's motivated sequence. And the reason that we use Monroe's motivated sequence is that it kind of takes the two forms I just covered and takes them a little bit further. And it is dedicated to activating, actuating your audience and getting them to do something. The Monroe's motivated sequence essentially has 5 components of getting our attention, telling us what the need is, telling us how to fix it, helping us see what that solution will look like, and then lastly, inspiring us to action. But I'm going to go over that one in detail in a separate screencast. So if you are being asked to use that format, which if you are in one of my classes, you are, then I would recommend you watch that screencast to round this one out. Otherwise, you are pretty much done with this one.